the Snow Queen. Chapter 1. The Magic Mirror. Once upon a time there was a wicked magician who had made a mirror which could at once make everything good and beautiful reflected in it shrink up to almost nothing, while ugly and useless things were made to appear 10 times larger and worse than they were. The loveliest landscapes looked in this mirror like boiled spinach, and the handsomest people became hideous, and looked as if they stood on their heads and had no bodies, and their faces were so distorted that their friends could never have recognized them. The magician thought all this was very amusing, and chuckled with delight at his clever invention. Those who went to the school of magic where he taught carried the mirror everywhere, until at last there was no country or person that hadn't been looked at through it. They even tried to fly up to the sky with it to see the angels, but the higher they flew, the more slippery the glass became. They could scarcely hold it. They flew on, higher and higher, until at last the mirror shivered so much that it slipped from their hands and fell to the earth, breaking into millions, billions, and trillions of pieces. And then it caused far greater unhappiness than before, for fragments of it, scarcely as large as a grain of sand, flew about in the air and got into people's eyes, making them see everything wrong, or only the worst side of what they looked at. For each little fragment had just the same effect as the whole mirror. Some people were unlucky enough to get a little splinter in their hearts. That was terrible. The heart became cold and hard, like a lump of ice. There are still some little splinters of this mirror flying about in the air, and we shall hear more about them very soon. Chapter 2. A Little Boy and a Little Girl. In a large town, where there are so many houses and people that there isn't room enough for everyone to have even a little garden, and where many have to be content with a few plants in pots, there lived 2 children, whose garden was only a little larger than a flower pot. They weren't brother and sister, but they loved each other as much as if they had been, and their parents lived in 2 attics, which were exactly opposite each other. The roof of one house nearly joined the other. The gutter ran along between, and there was in each roof a little window, so that you could walk across the gutter from one window to the other. The parents of these children had each a large wooden box in which grew herbs, and they had placed these boxes upon the gutter so near that they almost touched each other. A beautiful little rose tree grew in each box, which threw out shoots that were trained round the windows. The boxes were very high, and the children were always forbidden to climb over them, but they often got leave to sit on their little stools under the rose trees. In winter it was different. The windows were often frozen over, and then they heated pennies on the stove, held the warm copper against the frozen pane, and made a little round peephole through which they could see each other. The little boy was called Kay. The little girl's name was Gerda. In summer they could be together with one jump from the window, but in winter there were stairs to run down and stairs to run up, and sometimes there was wind and snow out of doors.
"Those are the white bees swarming there,"
said Kay's old grandmother one day when it was snowing.
"Have they a queen bee?"
asked the little boy, for he knew that the real bees have one.
"They have,"
said the grandmother.
"She flies yonder where they swarm so thickly. She is the largest of them, and never remains upon the earth but flies up again into the black cloud. Often at midnight she flies through the streets of the town and looks in at the windows, and then they are covered with strange and beautiful forms like trees and flowers.
Yes, I've seen them,
said both the children.
Can the Snow Queen come in here?
If she does come in,
said the boy,
I'll put her on the warm stove, and then she'll melt.
One evening, when little Kay was at home, he crept onto the chair by the window and peeped through the little hole. Just then a few snowflakes fell, and one, the largest of them, remained lying on the edge of one of the flower boxes. This snowflake grew larger and larger, until at last it took the form of a lady, dressed in the finest white silk, which looked like millions of star-like snowflakes joined together. She was wonderfully beautiful, but made entirely of ice, glittering, dazzling ice. She was alone, and her eyes sparkled like two bright stars. She nodded at the window and beckoned with her hand. The little boy was frightened and jumped down from the chair, and at that moment he seemed to see a large bird fly past the window. There was a clear frost next day, and soon afterwards came spring. The trees and flowers budded, the swallows built their nests, the windows were opened, and the little children sat once more in their garden upon the gutter that ran along the roofs of the houses. The roses blossomed beautifully that summer, and the little girl had learned a hymn in which there was something about roses. It reminded her of her own. So she sang it to the little boy, and he sang it with her.
The roses bloom, then fade away and die. The Christ child's face we yet shall see on high.
One day, Kay and Gerda were sitting looking at their picture books full of birds and animals, when, just as the clock in the church tower struck 12, Kay said,
"Oh dear, what a pain I have in my heart."
and soon after,
"Oh, something's got into my eye."
the little girl put her arm round his neck and looked into his eye. But there was nothing to be seen.
"I think it's gone,"
he said. But it wasn't. It was one of those splinters from the magic mirror, the wicked glass that made everything great and good appear little and hateful, and that magnified everything ugly and mean. Poor Kay had also got a splinter in his heart. His heart would now become hard and cold, like a lump of ice. He felt the pain no longer, but the splinter was there.
"Why do you cry?"
he asked.
"You look so ugly when you cry. There's nothing the matter with me." "Oh!"
he exclaimed again.
"This rose is worm-eaten, and this is crooked. After all, they're ugly roses, and it's an ugly box they grow in."
Then he kicked the box and tore off the roses.
Oh, Kay, what are you doing?
cried the little girl. But when he saw how it grieved her, he tore off another rose and jumped down through his own window away from his once dear little Gerda. Ever afterwards, when she brought the picture book, he called it a baby's book, and when his grandmother told stories, he interrupted her with a but, and when he could, he would get behind her, put on her spectacles, and mimic her to make people laugh. Very soon he could mimic everybody in the street. All that was singular and awkward about them, Kay could imitate, and his neighbours said, "What a boy that is!" But it was the glass splinter in his eye, the glass splinter in his heart, that made him careless whose feelings he wounded, and even made him tease little Gerda. One winter day, Kay came in with thick gloves on his hands and with his sledge at his back. He called to Gerda,
"I'm going into the great square where the other boys play."
and away he went. The boldest boys in the square used to fasten their sledges to the country people's carts, and thus drive a good way along with them. This time, while they were playing, a large sledge painted white passed by. In it sat someone wrapped in a rough white fur and wearing a white cap. When the sledge had driven twice round the square, Kay fastened his little sledge to it, so that when it went away, he followed it. On they went, faster and faster, into the next street. The person who drove turned round and nodded kindly to Kay, just as if they'd been old acquaintances. And every time Kay was going to loose his little sledge, the driver turned and nodded again. So Kay sat still, and they passed through the gates of the town. Then the snow began to fall so thickly that the little boy couldn't see a handbreadth before him, but he was still carried on. He tried hastily to unloose the cords and free himself from the large sledge, but it was of no use. His little carriage held fast, and on they flew like the wind. Then he cried out as loud as he could, but no one heard him. The snow fell and the sledge flew. Every now and then it made a spring as if driving over hedges and ditches. The snowflakes seemed larger and larger, till at last they looked like great white fowls. All at once they fell aside. The large sledge stopped, and the person who drove it rose from the seat. Kay saw that the cap and coat were entirely of snow, that it was a lady, tall and slender and dazzlingly white. It was the Snow Queen.
"We have driven fast,"
she said,
"but no one likes to be frozen. Creep under my bearskin."
and she seated him in the sledge by her side and spread her cloak around him. He felt as if he was sinking into a drift of snow.
"Are you still cold?"
she asked, and then she kissed his brow. Oh, her kiss was colder than ice. It went to his heart, although that was half frozen already. He thought he should die. It was, however, only for a moment. Directly afterwards he was quite well, and no longer felt the intense cold.
My sledge! Don't forget my sledge!
He thought first of that. It was fastened to one of the white fowls, which flew behind with it on its back. The Snow Queen kissed Kay again, and he entirely forgot little Gerda, his grandmother, and all at home.
"Now you must have no more kisses,"
she said.
"else I should kiss you to death."
Kay looked at her. She was very beautiful. He couldn't imagine a more intelligent or a more lovely face. She no longer seemed to him made of ice, as when she sat outside the window and beckoned to him. In his eyes she was perfect. He looked up into the wide, wide space, and she flew with him high up into the black cloud while the storm was raging. They flew over woods and lakes, over sea and land. Beneath them the cold wind whistled, the wolves howled, the snow glittered, and the black crow flew cawing over the plain, while above them shone the moon, clear and bright. Thus did Kay spend the long winter night, and all day he slept at the feet of the Snow Queen. Chapter 3. The Enchanted Flower Garden. But what happened to little Gerda when Kay didn't come back? Where could he be? No one knew. The boys said he'd tied his sledge to a larger, more handsome one, which had driven into the street and then through the gate of the town. No one knew where he was, and little Gerda wept bitterly for a long time. The boys said he must have been drowned in the river that flowed not far from the town. Oh, how long and dismal those winter days were. At last the spring came with its warm sunshine.
"Alas, Kay is dead and gone,"
said little Gerda.
"I don't believe it,"
said the sunshine.
"He is dead and gone,"
she said to the sparrows.
We don't believe it.
They answered. And at last little Gerda herself did not believe it.
"I will put on my new red shoes,
She said one morning.
those that Kay has never seen, and then I will go down to the river and ask after him."
It was quite early. She kissed her old grandmother, who was still sleeping, put on her red shoes, and went alone through the gates of the town towards the river.
Is it true that you have taken my little playfellow away?
She said to the river,
I will give you my red shoes if you will give him back to me.
and the waves of the river seemed to nod to her in a strange way. So she took off her red shoes, which she liked better than anything else she had, and threw them into the stream. But the little waves bore them back to her, as if they wouldn't take from her what she loved most, when they couldn't give her back little Kay. But she thought she hadn't thrown the shoes far enough out, so she stepped into a little boat that lay among the reeds, and standing at the farthest end of it, threw them again into the water. The boat wasn't fastened, and her movement sent it gliding away from the shore. She hastened to the other end of the boat, but when she reached it, she couldn't get out, for it was more than a yard from the land, and was gliding farther and farther away. Little Gerda was very frightened and began to cry, and the boat floated on and on with the stream.
Perhaps the river will carry me to Kay,
Thought Gerda, and then she became more cheerful and amused herself for hours looking at the lovely country around her. At last she glided past a large cherry garden, wherein stood a little cottage with thatched roof and curious red and blue windows. 2 wooden soldiers stood at the door, who presented arms as she floated past. Gerda called to them, thinking that they were alive, but of course they made no answer. She came close to them, for the stream drifted the boat to the land, and then Gerda called still louder, and an old lady came out of the house leaning on a crutch. She wore a large hat with beautiful flowers painted on it. "Poor little child," said the old woman. "What a long way the stream has carried you." And then she walked into the water, seized the boat with her crutch, drew it to land, and lifted the little girl out. Gerda was glad to be on dry land again, although she was a little afraid of the strange old woman. "Come and tell me who you are and how you came here," she said. And when Gerda asked if she'd seen little Kay, the old woman said that he hadn't come yet, but that he would be sure to come soon, and that in the meantime Gerda mustn't be sad, that she might stay with her and eat the cherries and look at the flowers, which were prettier than any picture book, for each could tell a story. Then she took Gerda by the hand, and they went together into the cottage. The windows were very high, and as the panes were red, blue, and yellow, the daylight shone through them in all sorts of various and beautiful colours. On a table in the centre was a plate of very fine cherries, and Gerda was allowed to eat as many as she liked. While she was eating them, the old dame combed her hair with a golden comb. "I have long wished for such a dear little girl," said the old woman. And as she combed little Gerda's hair, the child thought less and less of Kay, for the old woman was an enchantress. She didn't practice magic for mischief, though, but merely for amusement, and now because she wished very much to keep little Gerda. So fearing that if Gerda saw her roses, she would think of those at home and of little Kay, and might run away, she went out into the garden and stretched her crutch over all the rose bushes, which, although they were full of leaves and blossoms, immediately sank into the dark earth. Then she led Gerda into this flower garden. Every flower of every season of the year was there in full bloom. Gerda jumped for joy and played among the flowers till the sun set behind the tall cherry trees. The next day, and for many days, she played among the flowers in the warm sunshine. Gerda knew every flower in the garden, but though there were so many, it seemed to her that one was missing, and she couldn't tell which. She was sitting one day, looking at the old woman's hat with the flowers painted on it, and she saw that the loveliest among them was a rose. The old woman had forgotten the painted rose on her hat when she made the real roses sink into the ground.
What?
Cried Gerda.
Are there no roses in the garden?
She ran from one bed to another, sought and sought again, but no rose was to be found. She sat down and wept, and her tears fell on a spot where a rose tree had stood. And as soon as her warm tears had moistened the earth, the bush shot up as fresh and as blooming as when it had sunk. And Gerda threw her arms around it, kissed the flowers, and thought of the beautiful roses at home, and of little Kay.
Oh, how could I stay here so long?
She cried, and ran away to the other end of the garden. The gate was shut, but she pressed upon the rusty latch till it gave way. The gate sprang open, and little Gerda, with bare feet, ran out into the wide world. 3 times she looked back, but there was no one following her. She ran till she could run no longer, and then sat down to rest upon a large stone. And when she looked around her, she saw that the summer was past, that it was now late in the autumn. She had known nothing of this when she was in the garden, where there was sunshine and flowers all the year round.
How long I must have stayed there,
said little Gerda,
It is autumn now. There is no time to lose.
and she rose up to go on. Oh, how sore and weary were her little feet, and all around looked so cold and bleak. The long willow leaves had already turned yellow, and the dew trickled down from them like water. Leaf after leaf fell from the trees. The sloe alone bore fruit, and its berries were sharp and bitter. Oh, how cold and grey and sad the world seemed. Chapter 4. The Prince and the Princess. Gerda was again obliged to rest. Suddenly a large raven hopped upon the snow in front of her, saying,
Caw, caw, good day, good day.
He sat for some time on the withered branch of a tree opposite, eyeing the little girl and wagging his head. And now he came forward to make her acquaintance and to ask her where she was going all alone. Gerda told the raven her story and asked if he'd seen Kay. And the raven nodded his head half doubtfully and said,
I may. It's possible.
Do you think you have?
cried the little girl, and she kissed the raven and in her joy almost hugged him to death.
Gently, gently. I think I know. I think it may be little Kay. But he has certainly forsaken you for the princess.
Does he dwell with a princess?
Listen to me. But it's so difficult to speak your language. If you understand raven speech, then I can explain things so much better. Do you?
No, I have never learned it. But my grandmother knew it and used to speak it to me. Oh, how I wish I had learned it.
Never mind. I will tell my story as best I can.
And he told her all he had heard.
In the kingdom where we are now sitting, there lives a princess, so clever that she has read all the newspapers in the world, and forgotten them too. Not long ago, she was sitting on her throne and began to sing a new song, the burden of which was, Why should I not marry? Why not, indeed, said she. And she determined to marry if she could find a man who knew what to say when people spoke to him, and not one who could only look grand, for that was tiresome. So she called her ladies together and told them what she meant to do. We're glad to hear it, said they. We were talking about it only the other morning. You may believe that every word I say is true,
continued the raven.
For I have a tame sweetheart who hops freely about the palace, and she told me all this. Proclamations with borders of hearts and the initials of the princess were immediately issued. They gave notice that every well-favoured youth was free to go to the palace, and that he who could talk best with the princess and show himself most at home would be the one the princess would choose for her husband. The folk came in crowds, but it was no use. The young men could speak well enough while they were outside the palace gates, but when they entered and saw the royal guard in silver uniform, and the lackeys on the staircase in gold, and the spacious saloon all lighted up, they became quite confused. They stood before the throne where the princess sat, and when she spoke to them, they could only repeat the last word she had said. It was just as if they had been struck dumb the moment they entered the palace, for as soon as they got out they could talk fast enough. There was quite a long line of them reaching from the gates of the town to the palace.
But Kay, little Kay, when did he come?
asked Gerda.
Was he among the crowd?
Presently, we're just coming to him. On the third day there came a youth with neither horse nor carriage. He marched gaily up to the palace. His eyes sparkled like yours. He had long, beautiful hair, but his clothes were very shabby.
That was Kay! Oh, then I have found him!
He carried a knapsack on his back.
No, not a knapsack. A sledge. For he had a sledge with him when he left home.
It's possible. I didn't look very closely. But I heard from my sweetheart that when he entered the palace gates and saw the royal guard in silver and the lackeys in gold upon the staircase, he did not seem in the least confused, but nodded pleasantly and said to them, "It must be very tedious standing out here. I prefer to go in." The rooms were blazing with light. Ministers and ambassadors were walking about barefooted, carrying golden vessels, enough to make a man solemn and silent. His boots creaked horribly, yet he was not at all afraid.
That most certainly was Kay. I know he had new boots. I have heard them creak in my grandmother's room.
They really did creak. But he went boldly up to the princess, who was sitting upon a pearl as large as a spinning wheel, whilst all the ladies of the court with the maids of honour and their handmaidens stood on one side, and all the gentlemen in waiting, with their gentlemen and their gentlemen's gentlemen, who also kept pages, stood on the other side, and the nearer they were to the door, the prouder they looked.
It must have been quite awful. Did Kay win the princess?
The young man spoke as well as I do myself when I use the raven tongue. At least my sweetheart said so. He was quite lively and agreeable. He didn't come to woo her, he said. He'd only come to hear her wisdom, and that he liked her very much, and she liked him in return.
Yes, to be sure, that was Kay. He was so clever, he could reckon in his head, even fractions. Oh, will you not take me into the palace?
Ah, that's easily said, but how is it to be done? I will talk it over with my sweetheart and ask her advice. It's no easy thing, I may tell you, to get permission for a little girl like you to enter the palace.
Oh, but I shall get permission easily. When Kay knows that I am here, he will come out at once and fetch me.
Wait for me at the trellis yonder,
said the raven, wagging his head as he flew away. The raven didn't return till late in the evening.
Ah, ah! My sweetheart greets you kindly and sends you this piece of bread, which she took from the kitchen. There's plenty of bread there, and she thinks you must be hungry. As you have bare feet, the royal guard in silver uniform and the lackeys in gold would never let you enter the palace. But don't weep. You shall go there. My sweetheart knows a little back staircase leading to the sleeping apartments, and where to find the key.
So they went into the garden and down the grand avenue, and when the lights in the palace, one by one, had all been put out, the raven led Gerda to a back door that stood half open. They went up the stairs. A lamp was burning in a small closet at the top, and in the middle of the floor stood the tame raven.
My betrothed has told me a great deal about you, little maiden. Your adventures are extremely interesting. If you will take the lamp, I will show you the way. We will go straight along this way, and we shall meet no one."
They now entered the first hall. Its walls were covered with rose-coloured satin embroidered with gold flowers. Each room they passed through seemed more splendid than the last. At length they reached the sleeping hall. In the centre of this room stood a pillar of gold, like the stem of a large palm tree, whose leaves of costly crystal made the ceiling. And from the tree hung, near the door, on thick golden stalks, 2 beds in the form of lilies. One was white, and in it lay the princess. The other was red, and in this Gerda sought her playfellow Kay. She bent aside one of the red leaves and saw a little brown neck. Oh, it must be Kay! She called his name and held the lamp over him. He awoke, turned his head, and it was not Kay. The princess looked out from her white lily bed and asked what was the matter. Then little Gerda wept and told her story and what the ravens had done to help her. "Poor child," said the prince and princess, and they praised the ravens and said they weren't at all angry with them for what they'd done. Such a thing must never happen again, but this time they should be rewarded. When it was morning, Gerda was dressed from head to foot in silk and velvet, and she was invited to stay at the palace and enjoy herself. But she begged only for a little carriage and a horse and a pair of boots. All she desired was to go again into the wide world to seek Kay. They gave her the boots and also a muff, and as soon as she was ready, there drove up to the door a new carriage of pure gold, with the arms of the prince and princess glittering upon it like a star, and the coachman, the footman, and outriders all wearing gold crowns. The prince and princess themselves helped her into the carriage and wished her success. The wood raven went with her the first 3 miles. The carriage was well provided with sugar plums, fruit, and gingerbread nuts. "Goodbye," cried the prince and princess. Then little Gerda wept, and the raven wept out of sympathy. Then he flew up to the branch of a tree and flapped his black wings at the carriage till it was out of sight. Chapter 5. The Little Robber Maiden. They drove through the dark forest, and the carriage shone like a torch. Unluckily, its brightness attracted the notice of some robbers who couldn't bear to let it pass without plundering it.
"It's gold!"
They cried, and then they rushed forward, seized the horses, stabbed the outriders, coachman and footman to death, and dragged little Gerda out of the carriage.
"She is plump, she is pretty, she has been fed on nut kernels,"
said the old robber wife, who had a long, bristly beard and eyebrows hanging like bushes over her eyes.
"She is like a little fat lamb. How nice she will taste."
And saying this, she drew out her bright dagger, which glittered most horribly.
"Oh!"
shrieked the woman, for at that moment she had lifted her dagger to stab Gerda. Her own wild daughter jumped upon her back and bit her ear violently.
"You're not a child."
She shall play with me,
said the little robber maiden.
She shall give me her muff and her pretty frock and sleep with me in my bed.
And then she bit her mother again, till the robber wife sprang up and shrieked with pain, and all the robbers laughed, saying,
"Ha! See how she's playing with her cub!"
The little robber maiden was a spoiled child, and always had her own way. And she and Gerda sat in the carriage and drove farther and farther into the wood. She was about as tall as Gerda, but much stronger. She had broad shoulders and very dark skin. Her eyes were quite black, and she had a sad look. She put her arm round Gerda's waist and said,
She shall not kill you so long as I love you. Are you not a princess?
No, said Gerda, and then she told her all that had happened to her, and how much she loved little Kay. The robber maiden looked earnestly in her face, shook her head, and said,
She shall not kill you, even if I do quarrel with you. Then indeed I would rather do it myself.
And she dried Gerda's tears, and put both her hands into the pretty muff that was so soft and warm. The carriage at last stopped in the courtyard of the robber's castle. This castle was half ruined. Crows and ravens flew out of the holes in it, and large bulldogs, looking as if they could devour a man in a moment, jumped round the carriage. They entered a large smoky hall, where a big fire was blazing on the stone floor. A large cauldron, full of soup, was boiling over the fire, and hares and rabbits were roasting on the spit.
You shall sleep with me and my little pets tonight,
said the robber maiden. Then they had some food, and afterwards went to the corner where lay straw and a piece of carpet. More than 100 pigeons were perched on staves and laths round them.
These all belong to me,
said the robber maiden, and seizing hold of the nearest, she held the poor bird by the feet and swung it till it flapped its wings.
Kiss it,
said she, flapping it in Gerda's face.
The wood pigeons sit up there,
she continued, pointing to a number of laths and a cage fixed across a hole in the wall.
They would fly away if I did not keep them shut up. And here is my old favourite.
And she pulled forward by the horn a reindeer who wore a bright copper ring round his neck and was tied to a large stone.
We're obliged to chain him up, or he'd run away from us. Every evening I tickle his neck with my sharp dagger. It makes him fear me so much.
And then the robber maiden drew out a long dagger from a chink in the wall and passed it over the reindeer's throat. The poor animal struggled and kicked, but the girl laughed, and then she pulled Gerda into bed with her.
Will you keep the dagger in your hand whilst you sleep?
Asked Gerda, looking very much afraid.
I always sleep with my dagger by my side.
The little robber maiden threw one arm round Gerda's neck, and holding the dagger with the other, was soon fast asleep. But Gerda couldn't close her eyes, for she didn't know what would become of her, or whether the robbers would let her live. The robbers sat round the fire, drinking and singing. Oh, it was a dreadful night for the poor little girl. Then the wood pigeon said, "Cuckoo, cuckoo, cuckoo. We've seen little Kay. A white fowl carried his sledge, and he sat in the Snow Queen's chariot, which drove through the wood while we sat in our nest. She breathed upon us as she passed, and all the young ones died, excepting us two. Cuckoo, cuckoo, cuckoo."
What are you saying?
cried Gerda.
Where was the Snow Queen going? Do you know anything about it?
She travelled most likely to Lapland, where there's always ice and snow. Ask the reindeer bound to the rope up there.
Yes, there's always ice and snow there. It's a glorious land,
said the reindeer.
There, free and happy, one can roam through the wide, sparkling valleys. There the Snow Queen has her summer tent, but her strong castle is near the North Pole, on the island called Spitzbergen.
Oh, Kay, dear Kay,
sighed Gerda. When morning came, Gerda told the little robber maiden what the wood pigeons had said, and she looked grave and nodded her head.
Do you know where Lapland is?
She asked of the reindeer.
Who should know better?
Said the animal, his eyes sparkling.
There was I born and bred, and there I used to bound over the wild, icy plains.
Listen to me,
said the robber maiden.
You see all our men are gone, but my mother is still here, and here she will remain. At noon she will drink out of the great flask, and after that she will sleep a little. Then I will do something for you.
When her mother was fast asleep, the robber maiden went to the reindeer and said,
I should very much like to tickle your neck a few more times with my sharp dagger, for then you do look so droll. But never mind, I will untie your cord and let you go free on condition that you run as fast as you can to Lapland and take this little girl to the castle of the Snow Queen, where her playfellow is.
The reindeer jumped for joy, and the robber maiden lifted Gerda on his back, taking care to bind her on firmly, as well as to give her a little cushion to sit on.
And here are your fur boots. The muff I must keep. It is so pretty. But you shall not be frozen for want of it, for here are my mother's big gloves. They reach up to the elbow. Put them on. Now your hands look as clumsy as my old mother's.
Gerda shed tears of joy.
I cannot bear to see you crying. You ought to look glad. See, here are 2 loaves and a piece of bacon for you, so that you may not be hungry on the way.
She fastened these to the reindeer's back, opened the door, called away the great dogs, and then, cutting with her dagger the rope which bound the reindeer, shouted to him,
Now then, run, but take good care of the little girl.
Gerda stretched out her hands to the robber maiden and bade her farewell. And the reindeer bounded through the forest, over stock and stone, over desert and heath, over meadow and moor. The wolves howled and the ravens shrieked, a red light flashed. One might have fancied the sky was sneezing.
Those are my dear old northern lights,
said the reindeer.
See how beautiful they are.
And he ran on, night and day, faster than ever. But the loaves were eaten, and so was the bacon, when at last they came to Lapland. Chapter 6. The Lapland Woman and the Finland Woman. They stopped at a little hut. A wretched hut it was. The roof nearly touched the ground, and the door was so low that whoever wished to go in or out had to crawl upon hands and knees. No one was at home except an old Lapland woman who was busy boiling fish over a lamp. The reindeer told her Gerda's whole history, for poor Gerda was so cold she couldn't speak. "Poor thing," said the Lapland woman. "You have still a long way to go. You have 100 miles to run before you can reach Finland. The Snow Queen lives there now, and burns blue lights every night. I will write for you a few words on a piece of dried stockfish, a paper I have none, and you may take it with you to the wise Finland woman who lives there. She will advise you better than I can." So when Gerda was warmed and had taken some food, the Lapland woman wrote a few words on a dried stockfish, bound her once more firmly on the reindeer's back, and away they went at full speed. The beautiful blue northern lights shone all through the night, and at length they reached Finland and knocked at the chimney of the wise woman's hut, for there was no door above ground. They crept in, but it was very hot inside, so hot that the wise woman wore scarcely any clothes. She was small and very dirty looking. She loosened little Gerda's dress, took off her fur boots and thick gloves, laid a piece of ice on the reindeer's head, and then read what was written on the stockfish. She read it 3 times. After the 3rd reading she knew it by heart, so she threw the fish into the porridge pot, for she knew it was good to eat, and she never wasted anything. The reindeer then told his own story first, and next little Gerda's, and the wise woman twinkled her wise eyes, but spoke not a word.
Will you not mix for this little maiden that wonderful draught which will give her the strength of 12 men, and so make her able to overcome the Snow Queen?"
said the reindeer.
The strength of 12 men?
Said the wise woman.
That would not be of much use.
And she walked away, drew forth a large parchment roll from a shelf, and began to read. At last her eyes began to twinkle again, and she drew the reindeer into a corner, and putting a fresh piece of ice upon his head, whispered,
Little Kay is still with the Snow Queen, and he finds everything so much to his taste that he thinks it the best place in the world. But that's because he has a glass splinter in his heart and a glass splinter in his eye. Until he has got rid of them,
he will never feel like a human being, and the Snow Queen will always have a power over him.
But can't you give something to little Gerda to help her conquer this evil power?
asked the reindeer.
I can give her no power as great as she has already,
answered the woman.
Her power is greater than ours, because it comes from a pure and loving heart. If with this she cannot gain access to the Snow Queen's palace and free Kay's eye and heart from the glass splinters, we can do nothing for her. 2 miles from here is the Snow Queen's garden. You can carry the little maiden there and put her down close by the bush bearing red berries and half covered with snow. Now don't waste time gossiping, and hasten back as fast as you can.
Then the wise woman lifted Gerda on the reindeer's back, and away they went.
Oh, I have left my boots and my gloves behind,
cried little Gerda when she felt the biting cold, but the reindeer dared not stop. On he ran until he reached the bush with the red berries. Here he set Gerda down and kissed her, while the tears rolled down his cheeks. Then he ran back again fast, which was the best thing he could do. And there stood poor Gerda, without shoes, without gloves, alone in that dreary, desolate, ice-bound Finland. She ran forward as fast as she could, and a whole regiment of snowflakes came to meet her. Gerda then remembered how large and curious the snowflakes had appeared to her when one day she'd looked at them through a burning glass. These, however, were very much larger and much more terrible, for they were alive. They were, in fact, the Snow Queen's guards, and their shapes were the strangest you could think of. Some looked like great ugly porcupines, others like snakes rolled into knots with their heads stretching out, and others like little fat bears with bristling hair. But all were dazzlingly white, and all were living snowflakes. Little Gerda began to repeat the Lord's Prayer, and it was so cold she could see her own breath coming out of her mouth like steam as she spoke the words. The steam seemed to grow thicker as she kept on praying, and at length it took the shape of little bright angels, which, as they touched the earth, became larger and more distinct. They wore helmets on their heads and carried shields and spears. They thrust their spears into the horrible snowflakes, which broke into thousands of pieces. And little Gerda walked on, unhurt and unafraid. The angels touched her hands and feet, and then she scarcely felt the cold, and went on boldly to the Snow Queen's palace. But before we go farther with her, let us see what Kay is doing. He's certainly not thinking of little Gerda, and least of all can he imagine that she is now standing at the palace gate. Chapter 7. The Snow Queen's Palace. The walls of the palace were formed of the drifted snow, its doors and windows of the cutting winds. There were more than 100 rooms in the palace, the largest of them many miles in length. They were all lit up by the northern lights, and were all alike, vast, empty, icily cold, and dazzlingly white. In the midst of the empty, endless hall of snow lay a frozen lake. It was broken into 1,000 pieces, each piece exactly like the others. The Snow Queen, when at home, always sat in the middle of this lake. Little Kay was quite blue with cold, but he didn't feel it, for the Snow Queen had kissed away the shiverings, and his heart was already a lump of ice. He was busy with the sharp icy fragments, laying and joining them together in every possible way. He often formed whole words, but there was one word he could never succeed in forming. It was eternity. The Snow Queen said to him,
"When you can put that together, You shall be your own master, and I will give you the whole world, and a new pair of skates besides.
But he could never do it.
Now I'm going to the warmer countries. I shall flit through the air and look into the black craters, as they are called, of Etna and Vesuvius. I shall whiten them a little.
So away flew the Snow Queen, leaving Kay sitting all alone in the large, empty hall of ice. He looked at the pieces of ice and thought till his head ached. He sat so still and so stiff that one might have thought that he too was frozen. Cold and cutting blew the winds when little Gerda passed through the palace gates, but she repeated her evening prayer, and they at once sank to rest. She entered the large empty hall and saw Kay. She knew him at once. She flew to him and fell upon his neck and held him fast and cried,
Kay, dear, dear Kay, I have found you at last.
But he sat still, quite stiff and cold and motionless. His unkindness wounded poor Gerda. She wept bitterly, and her hot tears fell on his breast and thawed the ice, and penetrated to his heart, and washed out the splinter of glass. He looked at her while she sang,
The roses bloom, then fade away and die. The Christ child's face we yet shall see on high.
Then Kay burst into tears. He wept till the glass splinter floated in his eye and fell with his tears. Then he knew his old companion and cried with joy,
Gerda, my dear little Gerda, where have you been all this time, and where have I been?
He looked around him.
How cold it is here. How wide and empty.
Then he embraced Gerda, and she laughed and wept by turns. Even the pieces of ice took part in their joy. They danced about merrily, and when they were tired and lay down, they formed of their own accord the letters of which the Snow Queen had said that when Kay could put them together, he should be his own master, and that she would give him the whole world, with a new pair of skates besides. And Gerda kissed his cheeks, and they became fresh and glowing as ever. She kissed his eyes, and they sparkled like her own. She kissed his hands and feet, and he was once more healthy and merry. The Snow Queen might now come home as soon as she liked. It mattered not. Kay's Charter of Freedom stood written on the lake in bright, icy characters. They took each other by the hand and went forth out of the ice palace, and as they walked on, the winds were hushed into a calm, and the sun burst forth in splendor from among the dark storm clouds. When they got to the bush with the red berries, they found the reindeer standing by waiting for them, and he brought with him another and younger reindeer, whose udders were full of milk, and who gladly gave it to refresh the young travellers. The old reindeer and the young hind carried Kay and Gerda on their backs, first to the little hot room of the wise woman of Finland, where they warmed themselves and received advice about their journey home, and afterwards to the home of the Lapland woman, who made them some new clothes and provided them with a sledge. The whole party ran on together till they came to the boundary of the country, and just where the green leaves began to sprout, the Lapland woman and the two reindeers took their leave.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Farewell, they all said. And the birds, the first they'd seen for many a long day, began to sing, and the trees of the forest were covered with green leaves. Suddenly, the boughs parted, and a spirited horse galloped up. Gerda knew it, for it was one which had drawn her gold coach. On it sat a young girl wearing a bright scarlet cap and with pistols on a holster before her. It was the robber maiden, who, weary of her home in the forest, was going on her travels, first to the north and afterwards to other parts of the world. She knew Gerda at once, and Gerda had not forgotten her.
A fine gentleman you are, to be sure, you graceless young truant,
she said to Kay.
I should like to know if you deserve that anyone should be running to the end of the world on your account.
But Gerda patted her cheeks and asked after the prince and princess.
They are gone to foreign countries.
Replied the robber maiden.
And the raven?
Asked Gerda.
Ah, the raven is dead.
She answered.
His sweetheart is now a widow, so she hops about with a piece of black rag round her leg. She moans most piteously and chatters more than ever. But tell me now, how you managed to get back your old playfellow.
And Gerda and Kay told their story. The robber maiden took their hands and promised that if ever she passed through their town, she would pay them a visit. And then she bade them farewell and rode away out into the wide world. Then Kay and Gerda walked on hand in hand, and wherever they went it was spring, beautiful spring, with its bright flowers and green leaves. They came to a large town where the church bells were ringing merrily, and they knew at once the high towers rising into the sky, for it was the town where they'd lived. Joyfully they passed through the streets and stopped at the door of Gerda's grandmother. They walked up the stairs and entered the well-known room. The clock ticked and the hands moved as before. Only one change could they find, and that was in themselves, for they saw that they were now both grown up. The rose trees on the roof blossomed in front of the open window, and there beneath them stood the children's stools. Kay and Gerda went and sat down upon them, still holding each other by the hand. They had forgotten the cold, hollow splendor of the Snow Queen's palace. It seemed only an unpleasant dream, and Kay and Gerda gazed at each other. They now understood the words of their hymn.
Though roses bloom, then fade away and die, the Christ child's face we yet shall see on high.